Mafia hitmen are sadistic killers who torture, maim, and murder anyone who stands in the way of the powerful crime families. From Guiseppe Greco, who cut a 15-year-old boy's arm with a machete and dissolved his remains in acid, to Joe, the animal Barboza, who bit off the ear of one of his victims and chewed on the skulls of another. These are the deadliest mafia hitmen in history. Giovanni Brusca. Born on February 20, 1957, Giovanni Brusca is an Italian mobster regarded as one of the most dangerous hitmen for the Corleonese clan of the Sicilian Mafia, with about 200 murders under his belt. In his glory days, Brusca was known as the Pig due to his unkempt appearance, mirroring the filth in his soul. Back in 1992, Brusca planned and executed the brutal murder of Giovanni Falcone, an Italian judge who spent most of his life trying to overthrow the Sicilian Mafia. Like magistrate Rocco Cinici, who we'll get into later in this episode, Falcone was also taken out with an explosion. But instead of rigging his car with a bomb, Brusca planted 13 drums of TNT and Semtex under the section of the A29 motorway, near the town of Capaci, where they knew the judge would be driving through. As soon as Falcone got to the designated spot, Brusca detonated the explosives, instantly killing the judge, his wife, and his 3 bodyguards. Falcone's death was one of the most devastating mafia hits at the time, and it truly confirmed that the nation was now under the control of criminals. Months after Falcone was taken out, Brusca also carried out the murder of Vincenzo Milazzo, the boss of the rival Alcamo clan, along with businessman Ignazio Salvo. However, his most sadistic crime was the abduction, torture, and murder of Santino Di Matteo's 11-year-old son, Giuseppe Di Matteo. Matteo, a former member of the Sicilian Mafia, who also took part in Judge Falcone's bombing, was arrested on June 4, 1993, and while in custody, he decided to become a witness, revealing all the details of Falcone's assassination to the police. Of course, his former bosses weren't too happy about this, so in retaliation, they decided to pick up his 11-year-old son on November 23, 1993. While dressed as police officers, the mafia assassins convinced Giuseppe they were taking him into protective custody, which was customary for families of former mafia members who cooperate with the police. Unfortunately, the boy became a victim of his father's crimes. For 779 days, Giuseppe was tortured, beaten, starved, and grossly mistreated. His father was heartbroken, and even though he made a desperate trip to Sicily to negotiate his son's release, the mafia wasn't willing to show mercy. On January 11, 1996, after the boy had become physically ill from the torture he endured, was eventually strangled to death. His remains were subsequently dissolved in a barrel of acid, and as Brusca would later reveal, tears rolled down his eyes as the sadistic assassins ended his life for no reason. Although reports claim Brusca himself wasn't present during the final execution, eyewitness testimony reveals that he participated in the torture and called the final shots to callously murder the boy. But that's not where Brusca's story ends. Prior to this incident, he was also involved in the series of attacks launched by the mafia, after the state began cracking down on their activities in response to Falcone's death. Together with many other hitmen, Brusca executed a series of bombings at several tourist spots on the Italian mainland. This included the Via dei Giorgofili bombing in Florence, which killed 36 people, the Via Palestro bombing in Milan, which killed 5 people and injured 12, and the Via San Teodoro bombing in Rome, leaving 10 people dead and 71 injured. Giovanni Brusca would later be arrested on May 20, 1996, in a small house in Agrigento, Sicily, where he was dining with his girlfriend, their son, his brother Vincenzo, his sister-in-law, and their 2 children. As news of his arrest spread like wildfire, the city erupted in jubilation, and upon his arrival at the police station, many of the officers tore off their ski mask, signifying that they were not scared of him anymore. In 1999, following a dramatic trial proceeding, Brusca was finally sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of 11-year-old Giuseppe Di Matteo. Then, in 1997, he was slammed with an extra 26 years for Falcone's murder, followed by another life sentence in 2009 for the murder of Salvatore Carava. Many people believed Brusca would never walk out of prison a free man, but he soon began collaborating with the authorities, revealing intricate details about the mafia's inner workings. The valuable intel he provided helped officers solve several problematic cases and prevent some brutal attacks that would have resulted in numerous casualties. So, as a reward for his collaboration, Brusca's sentence was reduced from life imprisonment to 26 years. As expected, this didn't sit well with the general public, who believed that a man like Brusca deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. Many officials attempted to block his release, but since the authorities already signed a witness agreement with him, these agitations fell flat. He was eventually released on May 31, 2021, and placed on parole for 4 years. He was also offered a new identity and moved to a location where he wouldn't be recognized. Today, the brutal murderer walks around in an anonymous city or village somewhere, a free man like the rest of us. Guiseppe Greco. Between 1981 and 1984, the city of Sicily, Italy was thrust into a bloody gang war, and in the middle of it all was a man named Guiseppe Greco, who single-handedly carried out over 300 murders in his lifetime. Armed with his infamous AK-47, Greco led a team of mafia hitmen known as the Death Squad, who carried out high-profile hits and forced disappearances throughout Sicily and beyond, killing and maiming anyone who stood in the way of the Ciaculli family. Salvatore Inzerillo was one of those men, a powerful boss of the Passo di Rigano family, who was gunned down on May 11, 1981 in Palermo. At his graveyard, Inzerillo's 15-year-old son swore to avenge the death of his father, and Greco took that threat personally. So he abducted the boy, cut his arm off with a machete, and tortured him for hours. He then shot the boy in the head before proceeding to dissolve his corpse in acid, as a means of getting rid of the body without leaving traces. Unlike many of the other prominent hitmen of his time, Greco didn't just murder people because he was obligated to. Instead, he was known to enjoy the very art of torturing and watching life squeeze out of his target, which is why he's often considered a serial killer. He also participated in the infamous Christmas massacre of 1981 in Bagheria, where Giovanni Di Peri, the boss of Villabate, as well as innocent bystanders were brutally murdered. Then, in the summer of 1982, Greco also played a major part in the Circonvallazione massacre, which led to the death of Catani's boss Alfio Ferlito, as well as the Via Carini massacre, where Prefect Carolo Alberto Falaciesa and his wife were also shot to death. On June 25, 1981, Greco laid ambush against Salvatore Contorno, another prominent member of the Sicilian mafia. However, his plans failed miserably after Contorno shot him in the chest, although the bullet was stopped by his vest. While Contorno escaped getting killed, his friends and relatives were not so safe, as Greco and his accomplices picked them up one by one in an attempt to flush Contorno out. His other horrific crime took place on November 30, 1982, when Greco and his death squad invited Rosario Riccobono, longtime ruler of the Partana Mondello family, Noce boss Salvatore Scaglione, and 3 other men to a meeting in a country villa located between San Giuseppe Giotto and Monreales. Shortly after their arrival, the 5 men were separated and individually massacred, resulting in one of the most violent killings to ever come out of the war. By this time, Greco had risen to rank of underboss in the Ciaculli family, and due to the number of hits he had carried out, he wasn't required to take people out by himself. But due to the bizarre satisfaction he got from murdering people, Greco refused to delegate assignments to his underlings, and he continued to personally take part in these hits himself. In addition, he was also said to have been responsible for the car bomb that killed Magistrate Rocco Cinici and 3 other people in July 1983. The more people he murdered, the bigger he became in the crime family, and at some point he was even considered the main boss by some. He would eventually grow so big that the family began to get scared of his ambition and uncontrollable thirst for violence, which was when they started planning his assassination. The Mafia Hitman would later meet a brutal end in September 1985, when he was shot to death in his home by Vincenzo Puccio and Giuseppe Lucchese, 2 fellow mafiosi and his closest friends, Abe Kid Twist Reyes. This next killer was one of the most sadistic enforcers of Murder, Inc., a group of young hitmen who carried out contract killings for the American Mafia. Born Abraham Reyes on May 10, 1906, Kid Twist was the son of Jewish immigrants from Galicia. who spent his early days in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, New York during the Great Depression. After surviving a tumultuous childhood, Riles teamed up with two of his childhood friends, Martin Bugsy Goldstein and Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, and together they began a career in the criminal underworld. Although he had a relatively small stature, Kid Twist was a brutal killer who committed ruthless acts of violence against both innocent people and designated targets. According to verified stories, his weapon of choice was an ice pick, which he would ram through his victim's ear right into the brain. He became so proficient with using the ice pick that many of his victims are believed to have died from cerebral hemorrhage, making him one of the most feared hitmen in the city. Back then, most people knew him as a cold-blooded and psychopathic murderer, who could take a life simply because he wanted to. For example, on one occasion, Kid Twist was said to have murdered a worker at a car wash in broad daylight, just because he failed to clean a smudge from his car fender. According to another story, he also killed a parking lot attendant for failing to bring his car around quickly enough. As the days of Prohibition rolled in, Riles and his friend Goldstein were still teenagers, who were drawn into the gangster lifestyle. To satisfy their depraved desires, they found work with the Shapiro brothers, who ran the Brooklyn rackets, but they soon turned on them after Riles got arrested, and the Shapiro brothers didn't help him get out. He would later gain his revenge against them, and many believe he was responsible for their eventual wipeout. In 1940, the sadistic killer was implicated in a number of killings, and his name shot to the top of the wanted list. Realizing that he would be executed if convicted, he decided to cooperate with the cops and become a government witness. Although only 11 murders were attributed to him, Kid Twist knew about the inner workings of the mafia, and the shocking revelations he unveiled to the authorities sent a number of high-ranking mafia figures to the electric chair. This included his boss Lepka Buchhalter, who was executed for the murder of Joseph Rosen, a Brooklyn candy store owner, as well as Louis Capone, Mendy Weiss, his friend Harry Strauss, Irving Nitzberg, Frank Abundando, and even his childhood friend Bugsy Goldstein. But it was his confessions against Albert Anastasia that finally put the nail in his coffin. Anastasia was known as the chief executioner of Murder, Inc., and a high-ranking member of the Cosa Nostra, who authorities had been trying to pin him down for years. However, he was also pretty smart with his dealings, so none of their charges stuck, which was why they relied heavily on Riles' testimony to finally put him behind bars. The trial was set for November 12, 1941, but just before then, news began to spread that a $100,000 bounty had been placed on his head. So to protect him, the government locked him away in the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island, with his room guarded by highly trained detectives. But this wouldn't stop him from turning up dead. In the wee hours of November 12, Riles fell from his window in room 623 of the hotel, and according to the official report, he was trying to exit the building using a makeshift rope he made from his bedsheets. Due to the nature of his death, he became known as the canary who could sing, but couldn't fly. And even though suspicions have been raised that he was probably murdered by the mafia, his death was eventually ruled as an accident. Filippo Marchese. Prior to his death in 1982, Filippo Marchese was considered one of the top hitmen in the Sicilian mafia, known for murdering over 100 victims whose bodies were either chopped up and dumped into the sea or dissolved in acid. During his reign of terror, Marchese worked for the mafia boss Vincenzo Chiaracane, who was closely related to the Guiseppe Greco family in charge of Palermo's Ciculi neighborhood. As the boss of the mafia family in the Corso dei Mille neighborhood, Marchese carried out both targeted killings, involving both high-profile mafia members and simple underlings who he murdered just because he could. During this time, Marchese ran a torture chamber known as the Room of Death, a small apartment located along the Piazza Sant'Erasmo, where anyone and everyone who stood in the way of the Corleonesi were extremely tortured, butchered, and murdered. According to those who knew about this place, the only way to get out is in a body bag, which many of the victims weren't even allowed the dignity. Reports claim that Marchese enjoyed garroting his victims by putting a chain or rope around their necks and slowly tightening the grip till they stopped breathing. Like some of the mafia hitmen on this list, Marchese also carried out several hits, not just out of obligation, but simply because he enjoyed it, and was known to be a cold-blooded serial killer, who would often please himself while watching his victims get tortured. It is unclear whether he intended to humiliate his victims even further, or he simply derived sexual pleasure from watching the horrific display. But just like many of the mafiosi of his time, Filippo Marchesi was very slippery. And although everyone knew he was a hitman, he was very discreet about his activities, so the government couldn't pin anything on him. Much of what is known about him came from a common criminal named Vincenzo Sinagra, who made the mistake of stealing from a hitman in 1981. When he was caught, Sinagra was given 3 choices: leave Sicily, die, or become an errand boy for the Corleonese Mafia. He chose the third option and ended up working with Marchesi in the Room of Death. Sinagra would eventually be arrested on August 11, 1982, while carrying out a contract killing, and after spending a whole year behind bars, he began cooperating with the anti-mafia judge Paolo Borsellino. Sinagra revealed that while working alongside Marchesi, it was his job to hold the feet of the Room of Death victims while they got strangled to death. He also revealed names of several victims, as well as co-collaborators of Marchesi who participated in his gruesome murders, which was invaluable since the man himself was never caught. During the course of the Second Mafia War, Marchesi grew strong and rose in ranks in the Corleonese crime family. So much so that his superiors, Guiseppe Greco and Salvatore Riina, began to fear that he would soon become too powerful and possibly overthrow them. So, sometimes in September 1982, Marchesi was tricked to a warehouse by Salvatore Montalto, where he met his fellow hitmen Pino Greco, Giuseppe Giacomo Gambino and Salvatore Cucuzza, who caught him off guard, grabbed and strangled him to death. Just like many of his victims, Marchesi's body was also dissolved in acid, in a chilling case of poetic justice. In order to prevent a reprisal from his friends and allies, the bosses spread rumors that he had accidentally shot himself while cleaning his gun, and had to be quickly buried due to his notoriety. It wasn't until Cucuzza was arrested before the true details of his death were revealed. Edgardo Greco. For over 16 years, Edgardo Greco evaded capture by the Italian authorities, with many believing he was actually dead. But as it would later turn out, the former mafia killer had been hiding in plain sight after disappearing from the radar in 2006. Greco's days of criminality dates back to the 1990s, when he carried out several high-profile hits for crime boss Matteo Messina Denaro, also known as the Boss of Bosses. As a member of the notorious Cosa Nostra crime family, Greco formed a part of a mob known as 'Ndrangheta, which originated from the Calabria region in the Deep South, Italy, and has now become the most powerful mafia in all of Italy. While Greco was known for many atrocities and violent crimes, the most notable of them all was the murder of brothers Stefano and Giuseppe Bartolomeo, who were both beaten to death with a crowbar at a fishmonger's in the city of Cosenza, back in January 1991. Apparently the brothers were part of a rival gang, which threatened the activities of the 'Ndrangheta, so they had to be taken care of, and Greco was chosen as the man for the job. Shockingly enough, their bodies were never found, and many believe they were likely dissolved in acid. In addition to these killings, Greco was also accused of the attempted murder of another man later that year in the same city, as well as several forced disappearances, intimidation, extortion, and every form of vice in the book. In 2006, a judge finally issued an arrest warrant for him, but before they could catch up with him, Greco vanished into thin air. He would later surface 8 years later in the French city of Saint-Étienne, located southwest of Lyon, where he took on a new identity. With his new name, Paolo Demetrio, Greco began working as a pizzaiolo in an Italian restaurant, taking on the less dangerous stereotypical Italian job, and doing it so well that no one ever suspected such a talented chef could have such a horrifying past. At this point, he had already been given a life sentence in absentia back in Italy, and was declared wanted all over Europe. But since people didn't exactly know what he looked like, the former hitman continued hiding in plain sight for years, and would even go on to establish his own pizza place, which became very popular in the city of over 400,000 residents. But as the years flew by, Greco became more confident in his new identity, so much so that he began to let his guard down. This was what eventually led to his downfall. In July 2021, he appeared in a local newspaper feature, boasting of his new restaurant and his regional homemade recipes, and was described as Italian by birth, but local at heart. While the bit promoted his restaurant to more people, it also captured the attention of an Italian anti-mafia prosecutor named Nicola Gratteri, who has spent decades tackling the menace of the 'Ndrangheta. After identifying that the man posing as Paolo Demetrio could actually be the fugitive Edgardo Greco, the Italian authorities launched a surveillance operation in collaboration with the French police to confirm his true identity. On an unsuspecting day in February 2023, the authorities finally moved in and apprehended Greco, much to the shock of the community, which had grown fond of the man. His arrest caught international headlines and marked a major breakthrough for the Italian government in their fight against the mafia, and on the other end, came as a shock for the people of Saint-Étienne, who had grown fond of the man they thought they knew. His extradition is currently being processed, so he can be deported back to Italy to face the consequences of his actions. Joseph, the animal, Barboza. When mob enforcer Joseph Barboza started cooperating with the FBI in 1967, he became the first person to enter witness protection in American history. His eventual death at the hands of contract killers like himself is also regarded as the FBI's biggest failure till date. This tough-talking mountain of a man was a sadistic killer who confessed to 75 stabbings, 500 beatdowns, and more than 20 murders. But before he became a stone-hearted killer, Barboza pursued a career as a professional light heavyweight boxer and was known as the Baron. His sheer size and powerful punches earned him many victories, but after fighting his last match on September 23, 1961, he decided to test his hands at some criminal activities. But luck wasn't on his side at the start, and in 1950, he was caught and sentenced to spend 5 years at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Concord, but would eventually lead a massive prison break in the summer of 1953, 3 years into his sentence. Fueled by contraband whiskey and pilfered amphetamine tablets, Joe and his 6 other cohorts overpowered 4 prison guards and led the biggest prison break in the history of the correctional facility. But after escaping in 2 separate cars, they proceeded to beat up random people in the street and caused huge ruckus in bars situated in the Scollay Square of Boston, before they were eventually apprehended at a subway station in East Boston. He was subsequently brought back to prison, although that didn't seem to quench his thirst for violence. It is believed that Barboza first encountered figures of the organized crime group within the walls of prison, and when he finally got out in 1958, became an invaluable tool of violence and mayhem. Together with common criminals like Joseph W. Amico, Patrick Fabiano, James Kearns, Arthur Brarsos, Thomas DePrisco, and Edward Goss, to mention a few, Barboza built a reputation for his unruly behavior and sometimes unprovoked attacks. Although he was never officially inducted into the Patriarca crime family, since he wasn't of Italian descent, he would become known as Boston's most prolific contract killers and sidewalk soldiers. It is believed that he carried out most of his hits for mob boss Raymond Patriarca, and by 1996, his notoriety earned him a place among the most powerful men in the Boston underworld. His nickname, the Animal, emerged from his extremely violent tendencies, like one time when he bit a man's ear off out of rage, and another time when he chewed on the piece of a man's skull after it was shot off. His downfall would eventually begin in October 1966, after he and 3 local hoodlums were arrested on weapons charges while cruising the combat zone in Boston. His bail was set at $100,000, which he couldn't afford, and no one from the crime family showed up to get him free. Even after 2 of his associates managed to raise over $50,000 of the bail money, they were ambushed by some hitmen and murdered in cold blood before the money was snatched from them. Shortly after that, Barboza was subjected to a 10-day trial and sentenced to a 5-year term. And according to some insider information, the Mafia family was most likely behind his arrest and convictions. In the summer of 1967, Barboza's friend and associate Steve Flemmi met with him in prison and informed him that Gennaro Anguille and his brothers were planning to murder him. So in June of the same year, Barboza decided to spill everything he knew to the FBI, offering to testify to guarantee the protection of his wife and kids. The plan was to set him up with his own restaurant, alter his appearance with plastic surgery, and further protect Barboza in the exchange for information. But even though Barboza fulfilled his end of the bargain and aided the conviction of some major mafia members, the United States government never fulfilled any of its promises. As he began spilling secrets after secrets, the La Cosa Nostra offered to pay him $25,000 to stop talking. which he then raised to $50,000 before pulling out after consulting his lawyer. The same lawyer, John W. Fitzgerald, was attacked with a car bomb on January 30, 1968, resulting in the loss of his right leg. Fast forward to 1975, and Barboza was moved into a new apartment in San Francisco under the alias Joseph Donati. However, it didn't take long for Gennaro Angiulo to finally find out where he was hiding, and on February 11, 1976, as he was leaving his apartment, Barboza was hit by 4 shotgun blasts at close range, ending his life instantly. He was later buried in South Dartmouth Cemetery in Massachusetts. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.